Hi, everyone, and welcome to Training for Life Redeemed. I'm your host, Dan. As always, I'm joined by my father, David Jackson. We started last week, Dad, looking at the theology of the child, and we're going to be continuing that today. So today we're going to be looking at the idea of whether or not there's an age of consent, Dad, which generally is kind of accepted thing around the world. The idea that kids reach an age where they then can consent, particularly like medical fields and all that kind of stuff, where they get to make their own choices. They get held responsible for their choices, whether that be consenting to sexual relationships, consenting to driving, consenting to lots of different ages for different things. But we're going to be specifically focusing on the idea of there being an age of consent where there's this age or whatever where a child suddenly goes from being innocent to being held responsible for their decisions, and they know what the difference between good and evil, and are making decisions for themselves and are responsible for that. Yeah?
Yep. Sounds good.
Great. So, Dad, lots of people will tell me that there is an age of consent, and they will. There might be a couple of passages that kind of relate to it, but most of what I see when I'm talking to people about it is it's got to do with our culture and what we think of children more than it does with what's coming out of the Bible. Can you give us a bit more of a background, I don't know, about this idea of age of consent, where it's come from, why it's so popular at the moment, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, age of consent really is about the age at which we can hold a child accountable for what they're doing, and the degree to which we can hold a child accountable. It's not about their relationship with God. This is next week we're going to talk about children and how salvation works for children. But when we are dealing with children, whether it's as parents or as the church or school teachers or the police even, what are we dealing with it? Where's the level of responsibility, and how does that work? And that's a tricky question, because my wife keeps reminding me that God made children cute so that they live longer. Same goes for puppies. It's the idea that, when we look at a child and they're so cute and all the rest of it, and we make excuses, we rescue them, we don't hold them accountable, and then somewhere along the line, suddenly, wham bang, they are accountable. And where's the process? What are the cutoffs? What's going on here? So I think of cultural things like, how do you mark when a child reaches adulthood? How do you mark, what are the boundaries? When I was a kid in the 1950s and 60s, I was just thinking of this today. Boys up to year 7 wore short pants. So when you had hit puberty, then school uniforms changed and the boys got long pants. So that was like year 8. So you're in short pants because you're a child, and now you've got long pants on. You're not an adult, but you're a teenager. And what level of responsibility are we talking about? Back then, we were referred to as teenagers, or the police like to use the word youths. It's like Western Sydney. Everything that's bad happened is caused by youths.
Yeah,
youth trouble. So where's that cutoff? And it seems to be puberty is a pretty significant part of that.
Yeah, and I think throughout history, like I remember reading quite a few books when I was looking into, I had a son, so how do I raise a boy? And I liked reading Steve Biddulph's stuff. He talks a lot about the whole initiation process that happens throughout ancient history. It's existed for such a long time, and then suddenly the Western world's just like, no, we're going to get rid of that completely. And he talks a lot about how important it actually is for those kinds of things to exist and to mark a transition from childhood to adulthood, And he just said, he basically just says this whole idea of teenagehood is a made-up thing that the West has done so that the youth can do whatever they like and not be held responsible for longer.
Not be held accountable. Yeah.
From my memory, he didn't seem to have a great opinion of it. And honestly, when I think back, like when I look at it, and I think about initiation stuff and how things used to work, kids used to hit puberty, and then they would, boys would be taken away from their mums and turned into through initiation, whatever. And some of those initiation processes, sure, were very dangerous and inappropriate, possibly, but there was still that idea of, now you're a man, and so now you hang out with the men, and it's kind of when their apprenticeship type thing starts. They don't become full-fledged elders type men, but they're men, like they hang out with, and that idea of there being this teenagehood where boys and girls, like it's not just for boys, but they just have this period of time where they are
not
responsible. They want to be free and be responsible, but they also are not given that. And there's a lot of research into brain development these days, and people, your brain doesn't fully develop till 21. But from my perspective, I'm like, but your brain also develops according to how it's used. And so if you take the brain of someone who's coming out of a very hard context, whether it be the one that's in my head is like Sudan and the conflict that's happened over there and the immigrants that have come to Australia from that. If you look at their brains compared to a normal person who grew up in Australia's brain, I think that would be very, very different in terms of their ability to manage risk and to identify things and all that kind of, like, because they've had to do it. And I think there's that element of we've buffered these kids so they don't actually have to do it, and then they just don't do it until they need to.
Yeah, the idea of training a child for adulthood and staging the stages at which you challenge them with responsibility. We talk about the dignity of risk. So giving a child a hammer and saying, go for it. There's risks in every stage of this process. I actually think puberty obviously is a really significant stage. And I just love the story about Jesus when he hit puberty. So when you go to Luke 2, at the end of that, in the Jewish society of the time, up till a boy hits puberty, all of the children, or up to the age, all the children sit with the women. So the boys sit with mummy. But when they hit puberty, they don't want to sit with mummy. They want to be with the men, and rightly so. So how do you say to a boy, you are now a man? And the mark of that manhood seems to be, if you are physically able to father your own children, you are an adult. If you're a woman and you are now able to conceive, you're a woman, not a little girl anymore. So those changes. So I just love this thing. They go down to Jerusalem when Jesus is 12, because they've got to go down every year for the feasts. And they take Jesus. Usually people went from Galilee in a big mob for security reasons. It's a 100K walk. So 3 days to get to Jerusalem with the wife and the kids and the rest of it and the donkey. You get down there. Jesus has been traveling down with mummy. And when he gets down there, he's examined by the elders at the temple, and he passes his Bible exam or whatever process they went through. And so now he is with the men. So mum and dad leave and they're on the way back, and they're half a day out of Jerusalem. And it hasn't twigged that Mary thinks he's with Joseph because he's supposed to be with the blokes. And Joseph assumes he's with mum because he always has been. And they both look at each other and go, where is he? And he's back in the temple discussing the Bible. And they rebuke him for that. And he says, well, where do you think I should be? I'm in my father's house doing what I'm supposed. He's speaking to his parents as an adult. And I think maybe his father got a hold of him and dragged him off. But this is that transition mark. So in the synagogue, the boys come to the front. They demonstrate that they've understood the word of God, the Torah, the instructions. And when they pass that exam, their bar mitzvah, They then go and sit with the men. And the girls don't have a bar mitzvah because even though they might know the Bible and they know the Torah and all the things for adults, they're still girls. They're women, and they stay with the women. So there's no transition across the room there. These days, girls do a bat mitzvah. But marking that point of transition, and my observation with kids is that if you don't mark it, they're going to fight you for it. So your 13-year-old son is now going to be asserting his manhood. He doesn't want mum. He doesn't want to be a mummy's boy. He wants to be with the men, and he wants to be treated like a man and treated with responsibility. And you have to give it to them. You have to acknowledge it. And so as a high school teacher, when the kids came into school, I never refer to high school kids as pupils. That used to annoy me. Pupils are in primary school. Students are in high school. I would introduce, I would address them as ladies and gentlemen, not as kids or children in high school. It's just, we need to mark and bring that culture of respect in. And that's why age of consent, it's really not about consent, it's about responsibility and maturity.
Yeah, and so if we go modern now, and we're talking about psychological theories and all that kind of stuff that have influenced this idea of consent. So I know you want to talk about Piaget and his ideas and all the psychological things about, just generally how kids develop. And it's not that, his general ideas are terrible, but if you take them as cut and dry, up until this point, the kid's doing this, up until that point, just go, well, that can be very flexible for many kids. So tell us a little about that and the idea of how that's then shifted across to the church.
Yeah, well, back in 1932, Piaget came up with this idea of the stages of moral development among children. And he ratcheted up these stages. The final stage was moral autonomy, where the child basically makes up the rules for themselves, and they're resisting other people telling them what to do. They're setting up their own ethics, their own morals, their own lifestyle. And for Piaget, the goal was to have a child who is now an adult, able to think for themselves, able to reject society's values and come up with their own values. That was the ultimate stage of moral development. Along came a fellow called Kohlberg, followed by Fowler, Fennemer, Westerhoff, and a couple of others. And they decided that we could transfer this moral theory of development into a spiritual stages of development. So now that you come up with these models where children don't get converted, children just grow into being more and more Christian or not. It's an osmosis. It's a process that happens psychologically. It doesn't happen by information coming in, children making their own choices so much. So you can't look at a child of 5 and say, there's a child who would be mature enough to accept Jesus. So you've got these stages of moral development. They've got to get up to the last stage before they're recognized as their commitment to Christ is valid. And that this, spiritual formation, it's called, and it's often talked about in churches and theological colleges. And that's where I think we have some problems, because when we're dealing with these kids, and the psychologists have researched this stuff for decades, some kids get stuck in one of those stages. Some skip stages. It's scrambled all over the place. It doesn't actually work. Piaget's sample was way too small. So here we are, applying this process to every child when children aren't processes. They're people and they're individuals, and they process their understanding and their decision making differently for each one. So unless we recognize that, there's too many variables in this just to reduce it down to this little formula and then expect every child we're going to go through those processes. I've seen school programs, especially Sunday school programs, that are designed around Piaget and Westerhoff's stages. And you just lock all the kids into that. I mean, there's valid stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but to lock the thing in and just, one size fits all, that's a disaster.
So now then, what does the Bible actually say? So we've talked a lot about things that are not biblical. When it comes to this idea of an age of consent, what does the Bible actually say? Because there are a couple of passages that kind of hint at the idea of reaching an age of knowing the difference between good and evil. What they mean by that, I'm hoping you'll explain a bit more.
Yeah. I spent a fair bit of time on this one because when you're having kids, you want to get it right. So going through the Bible, the passage that's most often quoted is from Isaiah 7:14-16. So I'll read it. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. But for before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. So, at what age does a child know to refuse evil and choose good? He links it to eating curds and honey. Well, eating curds and honey is what you do when you wean a child off the breast. So we're talking about a child being weaned, and that correlates with the same stage in a child's development when the child would be mastering their first language. So we're talking about a 2-year-old. And what's the favorite word of a 2-year-old?
No.
No.
Yes, and mum.
Yeah, no and mum. Yeah, but no. When the child can voice their choice effectively. Now, is that a stage of where we can hold the child morally responsible for everything they're doing? Obviously not. How much does a 2-year-old understand? But we can hold a 2-year-old responsible for what a 2-year-old understands. And 2-year-olds know enough to know that when they're doing the wrong thing most of the time. You know that because they throw pretty good tantrums.
And they know how to hide stuff.
And they know how to hide stuff, and they know how to sneak around. And we are born in sin. It's part of the nature. We inherit it. And a 2-year-old can now express it, and we can now reason. Well, hopefully we can reason with a 2-year-old. What's significant about this passage is that he says, when the boy is 2 years old, when the boy reaches this stage, these kings that you fear, their land will be gone. So the northern kingdom of Israel and the Syrians were trying to invade Judah. And the king was absolutely terrified. He was outgunned at every level. So at this point, Isaiah takes a new wife. She is a virgin. She becomes pregnant. And literally within 2 years, Ahaz had called on the Assyrians, and the Assyrians had come in and wiped out Syria and the northern kingdom. So the 2-year thing is exactly what's going on here. So 2-year-old, the kid can voice their decisions, yes, no, and they know when they're in trouble.
Yeah, and you said there that it's the age when we can hold them accountable. But when we're dealing with this idea of age of consent or being held accountable, and it's not humans holding them accountable, it's God. He seems to have a lot greater understanding of who people are before they can talk without them talking. He designs them.
He sees their heart.
Yeah.
And
He knows
let's
their
face
thoughts. He knows everything.
yeah, they're conceived in sin. They're born in sin. They come in. I liken it to, people think that might be unfair, but Adam declared war on God. He was alienated from God. He became God talks about enmity, being an enemy of God. Well, the kids in Berlin or in London in the 1940s had absolutely no say in the decisions that adults were making. British bombs dropped on the kids in Berlin, German bombs dropped on the kids in England. You're on this side of the war. It's not something you chose. It's something that's who you are when you come into the world. And that's what that phrase means. We're born damaged. I didn't choose to be born with this body. I didn't choose to be 5'6". I didn't choose to be born in Australia. What are you grinning at? You can't take credit for being 6 foot tall either.
Nope.
These are things that we just inherit. But then after that, it's God the Holy Spirit is the one who saves us. He knows where we are. He knows what trouble we're in. And there's a process that's going to take place. So you read passages like Deuteronomy 1. I'll read 37 to 39. Because of you, the Lord, he's speaking to Israel, the Lord became angry with me, Moses, and he said, you won't enter the land either. But your assistant Joshua, son of Nun, will enter it. Encourage him. He's going to lead Israel to inherit it. And the little ones that you said would be taken captive, your children who don't yet know good from bad, they will enter the land. I'll give it to them. So he's talking about the infants who don't yet know, the ones who had just been born, and 40 years later, they're going to enter the land. They're going to be the army of invasion. So, and anybody born after that point. But the ones older than that, the ones who were adults, God held them accountable. You have, when Nehemiah did his big talk, Ezra the priest, he brought the law out, he read it to the whole assembly, to the men, to the women, and to all who could listen with understanding. So there's women and kids there, and to the extent that they can understand, we deal with them. But there isn't like one cut off. It's this process. Hebrews 5 talks about solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. We're told that Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. Well, so did we all. But, Jesus does it without sinning. But we've got to go through that learning process. So in a sense, it's not an age of consent or an age of accountability. It's a process of learning responsibility. And we are held responsible according to the level of our age. We're not just, you're not responsible because you're a child and now suddenly you've hit a certain age and whammo, you're in jail and you don't know what hit you. And I think that's a big problem because we teach children by not holding them responsible according to their age level. We teach children that they will never be held responsible. And then all of a sudden they have a birthday and bang, they are. And they don't know how to handle that. So this has huge impact for us when we're trying to bring the gospel to children. We've got to take into account their level of understanding. But at any level of understanding, if a child walks up and says, I want to close the deal with God, I want to believe in Jesus, I want to commit to him, we don't say, oh, you're too young, come back and see me later. We say, let's build on that. Let's accept that as having if it's a 3-year-old integrity, and let's build on it.
Yeah, because the Bible tells you to go and baptize them before you make them disciples, not the other way around.
Yeah, and discipleship is a commitment, not just something you're forced into. So, at the point where a 3-year-old can repent and believe. Your mother was converted at 5. I've met so many people who are converted in childhood and are still believers. The youngest, I think the youngest kid that ever came up to me when I was a pastor was 3. And she had the clearest profession of faith. I ran into her 30 years later. She'd just come back from working as a missionary. The median age for conversion is year 9. At that point when you are realizing that you're an adult, is the median age for closing the deal with Jesus. And people do it earlier than that. I'll just give you these examples. In the Roman Catholic Church, kids are confirmed at age 8 or 9 before puberty, sort of like an insurance policy, I think sometimes. Baptists usually don't baptize children or accept their profession of faith till they're between 12 and 16. Anglicans in my generation confirm kids around 14. There's all sorts of confusion about when you admit a child to the Lord's table. I remember vividly 1995, we had changed churches and we were looking for a church, and I took you guys to a local Anglican church, and we'd been there for a couple of Sundays, and the rector dropped in to visit us, and he said, "Oh, by the way, how old are your kids?" And I told him the ages, and all 4 of you had been converted. You'd been baptized as believers. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, but your kids aren't going to be taking the Lord's Supper at our church because they're under 15. And I said, "Well, where did that age come from?" He said, "Well, that's my decision." So rectors randomly decide how old a kid can be before they will accept their profession of faith or admit them into the full status of the church. And that's random. In the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, where we studied, teenagers were allowed to make their profession of faith at 14, but American Indians on the native reservation in Oklahoma, it had to be 20 because Indians are like children. It was incredibly racist and random. So we've got to, that's the thing we've got to throw in the bin. There is no biblical random age of consent, but the Bible recognizes that we train up a child in the way that they should go. And as they make their commitment to God and to Christ, we build on it. We don't tell them, "Come back and see me in a couple of years," Yeah.
Jesus already told off his disciples for telling kids to rack off and come back later.
Yeah. And that's a really scary thing, right? I had a minister refuse to baptize one of my grandchildren because the boy was 10 and his cutoff age was 12. And I said to him, "What on earth is going on here?" So the young man went up to the minister. This is a kid who wouldn't let us tuck him into bed at night until we'd prayed for some people's conversion that he cared about at 3. Okay, so at 10, he's waited this long to screw up the courage. He goes up and he asks, and the rector says, "No, you're not old enough, son. Come back and see me when you're 12. No other conversation was had. So I went and had a word with him. And he said, "Well, I don't think they're mature enough to understand the commitment that they're making in baptism." I said, "But you're happy with their commitment to Christ, which is a whole lot more profound, but not baptism. And where did you get the age from?" "Well, that's just my decision." And I'm going, "Well, welcome to being a rabbi. This is Pharisee stuff. We're making up rules and adding it to the Bible." And that did incredible damage. So you never turn a kid away who wants to come to Christ. That's a real passion of mine, just the damage that it does. So where does that leave us?
Well, we don't have an age, according to the Bible, of being held responsible to God. It's definitely some kind of merit to the idea of being held responsible to humans.
Yeah.
I think that's fair enough. Next week, we're going to be looking at this, how kids get saved, basically, and how that all works. So I'm looking forward to that. Dad, I can't wait to come back and chat with you again next week to learn more and to dive deeper. Thanks so much for what you shared today. I think it's been really good to think through where these color phases have come from and all the rest of it. And, you know, they're definitely not in the Bible, and everyone's got different ideas by the looks of it. But if you guys want to come and ask your questions and get them answered, please head over to trainforliferedeemed.com/115, so 115. It's the number of this episode. You'll land on the page there. There's a form. If you scroll down, you'll see a form where you can ask any questions about the theology of the child, and we will jump in and answer those questions as best we can as we move through the series. But for now, that's it for this week. We'll hope to see you next week.